The cruelest thing about growing old isn't the wrinkles or the aching knees. It's realizing the people you sacrificed everything for can smile at you while turning you into a joke. I was standing beneath a canopy of white roses and crystal chandeliers when I learned exactly how much my family truly respected me. The vineyard stretched across the Napa Valley hills like something from a magazine, glowing gold beneath the late afternoon sun. Guests in designer dresses and tailored suits wandered between marble fountains carrying champagne flutes that probably cost more than my first car payment back in 1972. My granddaughter Sophie had always dreamed of a wedding like this. Elegant. Luxurious. Perfect. And because I loved that girl more than I loved my own comfort, I had quietly spent the last 2 years making sure she would have it. I sold my late husband Walter's vintage watch collection. I refinanced the lake house we bought after his retirement. I even emptied a savings account I promised myself I'd keep untouched for medical emergencies. But none of that mattered to me while I walked toward the reception terrace holding the small silver gift box I'd bought Sophie that morning. Inside was the pearl bracelet my mother wore on her own wedding day in 1951. 4 generations of women had worn it. I wanted Sophie to have it before she walked down the aisle. A young waiter smiled politely as he pointed me toward the seating area. "Your table assignment, ma'am," he said, handing me a cream-colored place card with gold lettering. I smiled back and thanked him. Then I looked down. At first, I thought it had to be some kind of mistake. The words blurred together for half a second before my brain fully caught up with what I was reading. Eleanor Whitmore, the ATM grandma. My fingers froze around the card. Nearby laughter drifted through the air from a group of bridesmaids taking pictures beside the fountain. Somewhere behind me, glasses clinked while a jazz trio played soft music under a linen-covered gazebo. But in that moment, every sound seemed strangely far away. Like I was underwater. The waiter's face immediately turned pale. "Oh my gosh," he whispered, reaching for the card. "I'm so sorry. I think that one, but I had already seen it." And unfortunately, so had 3 guests standing only a few feet away. One woman looked down at the ground awkwardly. Another pressed her lips together like she wanted to pretend she hadn't noticed. A man in a navy suit gave a quiet nervous chuckle before quickly walking away. The waiter replaced the card with another one so fast his hands shook. This one simply said Eleanor Whitmore. Nothing else. Clean. Normal. Safe. But it was too late. My chest tightened with a kind of pain that only comes when humiliation arrives dressed as humor. "Just a mix-up," the waiter muttered. The wedding planner was fixing some joke cards earlier. Joke cards. I nodded slowly like I understood. Like I was supposed to laugh along too. Then I thanked him and walked toward my table before anyone could see my eyes watering. The reception terrace overlooked endless rows of vineyards rolling across the California hills. Every table sparkled with floating candles and imported orchids flown in from Hawaii. I knew exactly how much those orchids cost because I had paid the florist personally 3 weeks earlier after Denise claimed the budget had become a little tight. Denise. My daughter-in-law. Sophie's mother. The woman who somehow managed to turn every family event into a performance where she starred as the exhausted, selfless matriarch. Even now, I could hear her voice carrying across the terrace as she greeted guests loudly near the champagne tower. "We wanted this weekend to feel timeless and classy," she said proudly. "Sophie deserves the very best." We. Not once in 2 years had she publicly mentioned who was actually funding most of this wedding. I sat quietly at table 7 beside people I barely knew while servers carried trays of lobster crostini and mini crab cakes through the crowd. Across the terrace, Sophie laughed as photographers snapped pictures of her in a satin robe embroidered with future Mrs. Miller in gold thread. She looked beautiful. Happy. Young. For a moment, I tried convincing myself the place card really had been some stupid accident. But then I noticed 2 bridesmaids whispering while glancing toward me. One of them covered her mouth to hide a smile. That was when the truth settled deep in my stomach. Someone hadn't made a mistake. Someone thought it was funny. And the worst part was knowing family jokes are never created by strangers. I spent the next hour pretending nothing had happened, and if you have ever been a woman over 70 at a family event, you know exactly how exhausting that performance can be. You smile gently when people walk by. You compliment the decorations. You ask strangers where they flew in from. You become pleasant background music while everyone else enjoys the life you helped build. A server placed a fresh glass of sparkling water beside me while the sun slowly dipped behind the vineyards. Across the terrace, Sophie stood surrounded by bridesmaids as photographers adjusted lighting equipment around her like she was a movie star. Every few seconds someone laughed loudly near her, and each burst of laughter made my stomach tighten because now I could not stop wondering whether they were laughing about me. Denise floated through the reception area in a pale blue designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. She greeted guests with theatrical warmth, touching arms, throwing her head back dramatically whenever she laughed. I recognized that performance. Denise had spent 30 years crafting the image of a perfect suburban mother while quietly letting other people carry the real burdens underneath. "Eleanor," she suddenly called across the terrace with a smile so polished it looked painted on. "There you are. We need one quick family photo before sunset." I stood immediately because when you love your family, your body still responds automatically even after your heart starts warning you not to. I followed her toward the vineyard overlook where two photographers were arranging relatives in rows. Sophie stood near the center beside Jason, glowing beneath the golden California sunlight. For one beautiful second, when Sophie saw me approaching, her face softened exactly the way it did when she was little and used to run into my kitchen after school asking for grilled cheese sandwiches. But the moment vanished almost instantly as Denise began directing everyone like a stage manager. Parents in front. Bridesmaids to the left. Cousins behind them. Then her eyes landed on me. "Actually, Eleanor, maybe stand near the back beside Aunt Carol. We are trying to keep the immediate family centered." Immediate family. I felt the words hit harder than they should have. I had paid nearly $140,000 toward this wedding. I had helped raise Sophie after Denise went back to work when Sophie was 6 months old. I was the one who stayed awake beside hospital beds during ear infections, piano recital panic attacks, and the night Sophie cried for 3 hours after her first heartbreak at 16. But suddenly I was being arranged like extra furniture at the edge of a photograph. I quietly moved where Denise pointed. Nobody objected. Not Sophie. Not my son David. Not anyone. The photographer snapped several pictures while Denise wrapped one manicured hand around Sophie's waist like she alone had created this entire family. Then one bridesmaid looked toward me and frowned politely. "Can we move the older guests slightly farther back?" she asked. Older guests. Not grandmother. Not Eleanor. Just older guests. Denise nodded immediately. "Good idea. We want the photos to feel youthful." Something inside me cracked very softly then. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just enough for me to realize I was disappearing in front of people who no longer even noticed it happening. After the photos ended, guests drifted toward the cocktail lawn where waiters carried silver trays loaded with shrimp cocktails and tiny filet mignon sliders. I stepped aside near the fountain and pulled my shawl tighter against the evening breeze. That was when I overheard two women talking behind me. "Denise must have spent a fortune on this wedding," one whispered admiringly. "I heard almost $200,000. The other woman shook her head. "Well, at least Sophie will remember how much her mother sacrificed." I stood perfectly still while those words settled over me like cold rain. Denise walked by at that exact moment carrying a champagne flute. She heard them too. And instead of correcting them, she smiled modestly and said, "You know how mothers are. We do whatever it takes for our children." Then she looked directly at me for half a second. Not long enough for anyone else to notice. But long enough for me to understand something terrifying. This was not accidental. The jokes. The exclusion. The stolen credit. Denise was carefully rewriting the family story right in front of me. And everyone was letting her do it because the older a woman gets, the easier people find it to erase her. By the time dinner service began, the sky above Napa Valley had turned deep shades of lavender and gold, and the entire vineyard looked like a postcard designed to convince people that perfect families actually existed. Strings of warm lights glowed above the reception terrace while guests settled into their seats laughing over expensive wine and polished silverware. I sat quietly at table 7 beside two distant cousins from Arizona who spent most of the evening discussing golf communities and retirement cruises. Every few minutes someone from another table would wave politely at me, but nobody really came over to speak with me for long. It was strange how invisible a woman could become at her own granddaughter's wedding while still paying for nearly every candle burning in the room. A young server placed a bread basket beside me and apologized softly for the delay in dinner service. There had been a few payment issues with one of the vendors, she whispered nervously before hurrying away. Payment issues. I already knew exactly what that meant because 3 days earlier Denise had called me in tears claiming unexpected expenses had pushed them over budget again. She sounded so stressed that I wired another $12,000 without hesitation. I told myself it was for Sophie. Everything had always been for Sophie. As guests chatted around me, I noticed Denise standing near the bar speaking to an older couple dressed in designer evening wear. They looked wealthy. Country club wealthy. The kind of people who measured human value through zip codes and vacation homes. Denise laughed softly while touching the woman's arm. Honestly, this wedding nearly drained us, she said dramatically. But what can you do? Sophie is our only daughter. David and I agreed she deserved something extraordinary. My fingers tightened around my napkin. David. My son. He stood beside Denise nodding silently while sipping bourbon like he had rehearsed this entire story 100 times already. Not once did either of them mention my name. Not once did they mention the retirement savings I had spent. Not once did they mention the second mortgage I took out against my own home 6 months earlier after Denise insisted the vineyard venue required a larger deposit immediately or they would lose the reservation. The older woman smiled admiringly at Denise. Well, you are clearly an incredible mother. Denise lowered her eyes modestly like a woman accepting an award. You do what you have to do for family. I looked away before she could catch me listening because suddenly I understood something far more painful than simple disrespect. Denise was not merely taking credit. She was carefully building a public identity using my sacrifices as construction material. Every dollar I gave became another brick in the image she wanted the world to admire. A few minutes later Sophie finally came over to my table still glowing from photographs and champagne. Grandma, are you having fun? She asked brightly. I forced a smile immediately because no grandmother wants to become emotional baggage on her granddaughter's wedding weekend. Of course, sweetheart. Everything looks beautiful. And it did. That was the tragedy of it. The orchids floating in crystal bowls. The custom dance floor with Sophie and Jason's initials painted in gold. The 5-tier wedding cake decorated with sugar flowers so detailed they looked real. I had paid for all of it. Yet somehow I felt less welcome than the valet parking attendants. Sophie glanced distractedly toward the sweetheart table where Jason was calling for her. I am so glad Mom pulled this together, she said quickly. I know it was stressful for her. There it was. One sentence. Casual. Innocent. But it landed like a knife between my ribs. Sophie truly believed Denise had made all of this happen. She had no idea where the money came from. No idea how many nights I spent lying awake calculating interest rates and postponing my own medical procedures because I did not want her dream wedding downgraded. Before I could respond, Sophie leaned down to kiss my cheek. You are the best grandma ever, she said warmly before rushing away. I watched her disappear into the crowd feeling both love and heartbreak at the exact same time. Then, about 20 minutes later, I accidentally overheard the conversation that changed everything. I had stepped inside the main hall looking for the restroom when I heard Denise laughing near the catering office. The door was slightly open. Please, Denise scoffed quietly. Eleanor would hand over money to anybody who calls her sweet for 5 minutes. She is lonely and old. That makes people easy. Another woman laughed softly. Does Sophie know her grandmother paid that much? Absolutely not, Denise replied immediately. And she does not need to know. Let the girl think her parents sacrificed for her. It looks better. I stopped walking. My entire body went cold. Denise continued speaking in the calm, relaxed tone of someone discussing weather. Honestly, Eleanor should be grateful we still include her in things. At her age, most women are sitting alone watching television every night. The other woman chuckled again. Well, at least she is useful. Useful. I stood frozen in the hallway staring at the floral wallpaper while those words echoed inside my chest. Not loved. Not respected. Useful. And in that moment I realized the humiliation was never accidental. They had reduced me to a funding source long before this wedding weekend even began. I do not remember walking back to the reception after overhearing Denise in that hallway. I only remember the strange feeling of numbness spreading through my chest while the vineyard lights blurred softly around me. There is a particular kind of heartbreak that comes with realizing you have been deeply loved by someone who only loved what you provided. At 72 years old, I thought I understood disappointment. I had buried my husband after 46 years of marriage. I had survived breast cancer at 63. I had watched lifelong friends disappear one funeral at a time. But nothing prepares a woman for the moment she understands her own family has slowly transformed her into an object. By the time I returned to the terrace, dinner had already started. Expensive wine flowed across the tables while guests complimented the filet mignon and sea bass selections. A jazz singer performed near the dance floor in a silky black gown while couples swayed beneath hanging lights. The entire evening looked elegant enough to belong in a bridal magazine. Denise spotted me immediately and smiled with fake concern. Eleanor, there you are, she said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. I was worried you got lost. Lost? As if I were some confused elderly woman wandering away from a nursing home instead of the person funding half the event. I forced a small smile and sat down quietly. Across the room, Sophie and Jason moved from table to table greeting guests while photographers followed them constantly. Sophie looked radiant. Every time she smiled, I saw flashes of the little girl who used to crawl into my lap during thunderstorms. That was the hardest part. My love for her had not disappeared simply because the people around her had become selfish. If anything, it made the ache worse. Halfway through dinner, Denise suddenly stood and tapped her champagne glass with a silver spoon. Attention everyone, she announced brightly. Conversation softened across the terrace. Before dessert arrives, I just want to say how grateful David and I are that all of you could celebrate this special weekend with our family. More applause followed. Denise placed one hand dramatically over her chest while tears almost formed in her eyes. I had seen that performance many times before. Planning this wedding has been exhausting, she continued with a soft laugh. There were moments I honestly thought we would not pull it off financially or emotionally. Guests chuckled sympathetically. But when you love your child, you find a way. More applause. Then came the line that nearly broke me completely. Denise raised her glass toward Sophie. Every centerpiece, every flower, every tiny detail came from a mother's heart. People actually stood to applaud her. Stood. I sat frozen in my chair while dozens of strangers celebrated the woman who had mocked me only an hour earlier for being old and lonely. My son David clapped beside her without hesitation. Sophie wiped tears from her eyes, smiling proudly at her mother. Nobody looked at me. Nobody wondered why my hands trembled beneath the tablecloth. Then something unexpected happened. A young woman approached my chair quietly while everyone focused on Denise's speech. She wore a black blazer with a wedding planner badge clipped to her pocket. Mrs. Whitmore, she whispered nervously. May I speak with you privately for just 1 second? I followed her toward the edge of the terrace near the vineyard path where the music sounded softer beneath the night air. The young woman looked uncomfortable before speaking. I know this is not my place, she said carefully, but I thought you deserved to know something. My stomach tightened immediately. What is it? She hesitated. The place card earlier tonight was not an accident. I stared at her silently while the distant sound of laughter drifted across the vineyard. Mrs. Whitmore, your daughter-in-law approved those cards personally during rehearsal setup yesterday. Some of the staff thought it was inappropriate, but she called it a harmless family joke. For a second I honestly could not breathe. The planner lowered her voice further. There were actually 3 versions printed. One said ATM Grandma. Another said sponsor of the bride. The staff removed the others after some guests complained. My chest felt hollow. Completely hollow. Why are you telling me this? I asked quietly. The young woman looked genuinely sad. Because my grandmother raised me, she said softly. And if somebody treated her that way, I would want someone to tell her the truth. I nodded once because I could not trust myself to speak. Then she added the sentence that changed everything inside me. Also, I think you should know most of the vendor accounts are still under your name and trust account authorization. The florist asked earlier whether future payments would continue processing through you. She walked away before I could answer. I remained standing alone beside the vineyard staring into the darkness while cold night air brushed against my skin. Somewhere behind me, guests laughed while glasses clinked and music played beneath glowing lights that I had paid for. And for the first time all weekend, the sadness inside me slowly began transforming into something else entirely. Clarity. That night, for the first time since arriving in Napa Valley, I stopped crying. There comes a moment in every woman's life when sadness finally burns itself out and leaves something colder behind. Not hatred. Not revenge. Just clarity sharp enough to cut through every excuse you have been making for people who never deserved your loyalty in the first place. I walked slowly back toward the hotel attached to the Vineyard Resort while laughter and music echoed behind me across the hills. Guests danced beneath the lights while waiters carried trays of champagne through crowds dressed in silk and diamonds. Somewhere inside that celebration, my family was smiling for photographs financed by the woman they had reduced to a joke. But something inside me had changed permanently beside that vineyard path. By the time I reached my suite, my hands no longer trembled. The bridal party had reserved the entire top floor of the resort, but my room sat at the far end near the service elevator because, according to Denise, the younger guests needed better access for the after party. I remembered apologizing when she told me that 3 weeks earlier. Actually apologizing. As if my existence itself had become inconvenient. I unlocked the door and stepped into the quiet darkness of the suite. The room overlooked endless vineyards glowing silver beneath the moonlight. On the marble desk near the window sat my leather folder filled with wedding contracts, receipts, transfer confirmations, and account information. I stared at it for a long moment before slowly taking off my earrings and placing them beside the lamp. Then I poured myself a glass of water and sat down. People love telling older women to be the bigger person. What they really mean is remain silent while others mistreat you comfortably. They expect grandmothers to absorb disrespect gracefully because society romanticizes elderly sacrifice as long as it stays quiet and useful. But sitting there alone in that hotel room, I realized something important. I had mistaken endless giving for love. I opened the folder carefully. Every payment record sat exactly where I left it. $48,000 for the vineyard reservation. $22,000 for catering deposits. $17,000 for flowers and imported arrangements. $9,000 toward rehearsal events. Additional emergency transfers every few weeks whenever Denise claimed another unexpected crisis threatened Sophie's perfect wedding. Some transfers still had my handwritten notes beside them. For Sophie. Make her happy. Walter would have wanted this. My chest tightened reading those words. Walter. My husband would have seen through Denise years ago. He always used to tell me, Eleanor, kind people attract greedy ones because generosity looks weak to selfish minds. At the time, I thought he was becoming cynical with age. Now I understood he had simply learned lessons I refused to accept. I opened my banking application on the tablet beside the bed. The planner had been correct. Most vendor accounts still routed through my trust authorization because several payments had exceeded daily transfer limits on Denise's accounts months earlier. Denise had begged me to leave everything under my name temporarily for convenience. I remembered how grateful she acted at the time. Suddenly my phone buzzed beside the folder. A text from Denise appeared. Do not forget florist balance tomorrow morning. They are asking again. No thank you. No apology. No acknowledgement that she had publicly humiliated me all evening. Just another demand. I stared at the message for several seconds before placing the phone face down on the table. Then another message arrived from Sophie. Love you, Grandma. Today was magical. That one hurt more. Because Sophie still had no idea. She truly believed this entire weekend existed because of her parents' sacrifices. Denise had carefully protected that illusion while using me like a silent investor standing behind the curtain. I leaned back slowly in the chair and closed my eyes. For years I had convinced myself that keeping peace inside the family mattered more than preserving my dignity. I tolerated disrespect because I feared becoming the difficult older woman everyone whispers about after Thanksgiving dinner. I paid bills quietly because I thought love meant helping without expecting recognition. But now I finally saw the truth. People who truly love you do not humiliate you privately while celebrating your sacrifices publicly as their own achievements. Around midnight, I picked up the phone again. Calmly. Slowly. Without anger. I contacted the bank representative assigned to my trust account. Then I requested temporary review holds on all pending wedding-related transfers scheduled for the following morning, including the florist balance, final catering release, orchestra payment, and honeymoon wire authorization. The representative sounded surprised but professional. Would you like all outgoing transactions paused pending personal confirmation? Yes, I answered quietly. Every single one. After the call ended, silence filled the room again. I expected guilt. Instead I felt something almost unfamiliar. Peace. Real peace. Not the exhausting fake peace that comes from swallowing humiliation to keep other people comfortable. Actual peace. Outside my suite window, the vineyard lights shimmered softly beneath the California night sky while distant music continued from the reception below. Somewhere downstairs Denise was probably still charming guests while spending money she believed would always appear no matter how cruel she became. I walked toward the window and looked out across the dark hills for a very long time. Then I whispered the words I should have said years earlier. I am done financing my own disrespect. I slept better that night than I had in months. Not because my problems disappeared, but because for the first time in years I stopped volunteering to be mistreated. When morning sunlight spilled across the vineyard hills outside my suite window, the entire resort looked peaceful and expensive and carefully curated for photographs. Somewhere downstairs makeup artists were preparing bridesmaids while florists adjusted centerpieces worth more than some people's monthly rent. Wedding mornings always carry a strange energy. Everyone rushes around pretending perfection matters more than honesty. I sat quietly near the window drinking black coffee while my phone vibrated repeatedly against the marble nightstand. 3 missed calls from Denise. 2 from David. Another message appeared before I even picked up the phone. Florist says payment did not clear. Call me immediately. I took another slow sip of coffee before finally answering the 4th call. Denise sounded breathless and irritated before I could even say hello. Eleanor, what is going on with the accounts? She snapped. The florist is refusing final setup until the transfer clears. I looked out across the vineyards calmly. Good morning to you too. Silence hit the line for half a second. Then Denise lowered her voice into that fake sweet tone she used whenever she wanted money. This is not funny right now. The ceremony starts in 4 hours. I know exactly when the ceremony starts, I replied quietly. I paid for it. Another silence. Colder this time. What exactly is that supposed to mean? She asked carefully. I could almost picture the expression on her face tightening beneath layers of expensive makeup. It means the accounts are under review. Review? Her voice rose immediately. Why would you review anything today of all days? I set my coffee cup down gently. Because last night I learned some interesting things about how this family sees me. Denise exhaled sharply. Oh my God. Are you seriously being dramatic right now? Dramatic. The word selfish people always use when consequences finally arrive. The florist needs $18,000 released immediately, she continued. The orchestra manager is threatening to leave if the balance is not paid before noon. Do you understand how embarrassing this is? I almost laughed hearing her use the word embarrassing after everything she had done. Actually, I answered softly, I understand embarrassment very well. Then I hung up. 20 minutes later the chaos truly began. From my suite window I could see staff rushing across the vineyard lawn carrying floral arrangements while event coordinators spoke anxiously into headsets. A white delivery van pulled away from the property after what looked like a heated conversation near the reception tent. My phone continued buzzing non-stop. David called twice more before finally sending a text message. Mom, please stop this. People are panicking. People are panicking. Funny how nobody panicked while I was being humiliated publicly the night before. I dressed slowly that morning. Navy blue pantsuit. Pearl earrings. Soft makeup. The kind of outfit respectable older women wear when they no longer feel the need to impress anyone. By the time I stepped into the hotel lobby, tension hung over the resort like storm clouds. Staff members moved quickly between hallways whispering to one another. Near the entrance, two florists argued beside half-finished arrangements while a catering manager flipped through paperwork looking furious. Denise spotted me immediately from across the lobby. She marched toward me so quickly her heels clicked sharply against the marble floor. What are you doing? She hissed through clenched teeth. Do you have any idea how bad this looks? I studied her calmly. Perfect hair. Designer gown bag draped over one arm. Diamond earrings bought with money she claimed not to have 6 months earlier. Interesting question, I said quietly. I was wondering the same thing when I saw my place card yesterday. Her face drained of color instantly. Are you seriously still upset about that stupid joke? No, I replied. I am upset because it was not a joke. It was honesty. Denise glanced around nervously to make sure nobody nearby could hear. Eleanor, this is Sophie's wedding day. Whatever personal feelings you have can wait. There it was again. My dignity reduced to an inconvenience interrupting other people's comfort. Before I could answer, Sophie suddenly appeared near the lobby staircase wearing a silk bridal robe with tears already forming in her eyes. Mom, she whispered anxiously to Denise. The wedding planner says the quartet will not play unless the remaining invoice gets approved. Then Sophie noticed me standing there. Grandma, she asked softly. What is happening? I looked at her beautiful frightened face and for one painful moment I almost gave in. Almost fixed everything again. That had always been my role in this family. Quietly absorb pain. Quietly solve problems. Quietly disappear afterward. But then I remembered Denise laughing in that hallway about lonely old women. I remembered the place card. I remembered being shoved to the back of family photographs like unwanted furniture. And suddenly I realized something important. Shielding people from consequences only teaches them they can continue hurting you safely. Denise stepped forward quickly before I could speak. There was some confusion with the bank, she lied smoothly. Your grandmother is sorting it out. Sophie turned toward me hopefully. Grandma, can you help? The entire lobby seemed to go silent around us. Staff members pretended not to stare while waiting for my answer. I held Sophie's gaze gently and spoke the calmest words I had said in years. Sweetheart, I said softly, before I decide what happens next, I think it is finally time this family tells the truth about who has actually been paying for this wedding. Sophie stared at me as though I had suddenly begun speaking another language. Around us, the elegant hotel lobby remained frozen in uncomfortable silence while staff members pretended not to listen. Denise crossed her arms immediately, already preparing to control the situation the way she always did whenever truth threatened the image she worked so hard to maintain. "Eleanor," she warned sharply, "this is not the time." But for the first time in many years, I realized something important. People like Denise survive by making sure there is never a convenient time for honesty. There is always a birthday, a holiday, a graduation, a wedding, some excuse explaining why their behavior should be ignored a little longer to protect the family atmosphere. Meanwhile, the person being mistreated keeps shrinking smaller and smaller, trying not to ruin everyone else's mood. I looked directly at Sophie. "Sweetheart, do you know whose bank account paid for this venue?" Sophie blinked in confusion. "Mom said you helped a little with some extras." Denise stepped forward instantly. "Enough." But I did not stop speaking. "Do you know who paid for the catering deposits? The florist? The musicians? The honeymoon suite in Tuscany?" Sophie slowly turned toward her mother. "Mom?" Denise forced a strained laugh. "Your grandmother is upset and trying to create drama because she misunderstood a joke yesterday." A joke. Even now she reduced cruelty to humor. I reached calmly into my purse and removed the leather folder I had carried downstairs. Then I handed Sophie several payment confirmations. Wire transfers. Vendor receipts. Mortgage paperwork. Her expression changed almost immediately as she scanned the pages. "Grandma," she whispered softly. "You paid all this?" Denise tried grabbing the papers from her hands. "Those are private financial documents." But Sophie stepped backward. "Mom," she said carefully, "why is Grandma's name on everything?" David finally entered the lobby looking exhausted and pale. "Can we please discuss this privately?" he muttered. "There are guests everywhere." That sentence alone told me he already knew the truth. He was not shocked. He was embarrassed the truth had become visible. Sophie looked from face to face while panic slowly replaced confusion in her eyes. "Wait," she said quietly. "You told me you and Dad emptied your savings for this wedding." Denise folded her arms defensively. "We did sacrifice. Emotionally. Mentally. Planning this entire event was exhausting." Even now she could not simply tell the truth directly. A hotel employee approached nervously holding a clipboard. "Mrs. Whitmore?" he asked carefully. "The catering director says unless the payment authorization issue is resolved within the next hour, they may need to scale back reception services." Denise looked ready to explode. "Do you see what you are doing?" she snapped at me once the employee walked away. "You are humiliating this family." I almost smiled at the irony. Humiliation suddenly mattered now that consequences had arrived for someone else. Sophie continued staring down at the paperwork in disbelief. "Grandma refinanced her house," she whispered. David rubbed his forehead heavily. "Sophie, your grandmother offered to help." "Help?" Sophie's voice cracked. "This is not helping. This is paying for practically everything." Denise immediately pointed toward me. "Because she insisted. Nobody forced her." There it was. The final selfish defense. As though generosity erased exploitation. I looked at Sophie quietly. "I would have done it happily," I told her honestly. "If I had been treated like family instead of a punchline." Sophie frowned slowly. "What does that mean?" Denise answered before I could speak. "Your grandmother is overreacting to a seating card prank." Sophie looked confused. "What seating card?" For a moment nobody spoke. Denise's silence finally betrayed her more than any accusation could have. I reached into my purse once more and removed the folded place card I had kept since yesterday evening. Carefully, I handed it to Sophie. She unfolded it slowly. Then her entire face drained of color. Eleanor Whitmore, the ATM grandma. Sophie stared at the words for several seconds without breathing. Mom, she whispered. Denise immediately shook her head. It was harmless. People joke like that all the time. Who made this? Sophie asked quietly. Denise avoided her eyes. That answer alone was enough. Tears filled Sophie's eyes as she looked back at me. Grandma. I did not know. And I believed her. That was the tragedy underneath everything. Sophie had become so distracted by luxury and wedding excitement that she never stopped asking who was silently carrying the cost beneath all the beauty surrounding her. Denise stepped forward, desperately trying to regain control. Sophie, please do not let this ruin your wedding day. But something had shifted in the room now. Staff members were openly watching. Guests entering the lobby slowed their steps after sensing tension. Even David looked ashamed standing beside his wife. Then the catering director himself approached holding a tablet filled with invoices. I apologize deeply, he said awkwardly, but our accounting department needs authorization from Mrs. Whitmore directly before continuing full reception service. He handed me the tablet respectfully. Denise looked horrified. Because for the first time the entire illusion collapsed publicly. Everyone could now see who actually held the power. I studied the invoices calmly while the lobby remained silent around us. Then I looked up at Sophie. Sweetheart, I said softly, I never wanted credit for any of this. I only wanted kindness. Sophie began crying quietly while still clutching the cruel place card in her hands. And in that moment, watching my granddaughter finally understand the truth, I realized something surprising. Revenge did not feel satisfying the way angry people imagine it will. Mostly it felt sad. Because sometimes the hardest part of standing up for yourself is realizing how easily the people you love were willing to stand by while you disappeared. I remember the exact moment Sophie stopped seeing the wedding as a celebration and started seeing it as something else entirely. It was not dramatic. There were no shouting matches, no shattered glasses, no cinematic collapse like people imagine in stories. It was much quieter than that. It was the silence of realization settling into a young woman who suddenly understood that her entire perfect day had been built on a lie she never questioned. The lobby of the Vineyard Resort felt different now. The same marble floors, the same soft lighting, the same polished elegance that had impressed guests just hours earlier now felt heavy, almost suffocating. Staff members stood at a respectful distance while holding tablets and invoices, waiting for instructions that no longer came from Denise. For the first time since the wedding weekend began, Denise was not directing anything. She stood rigidly beside David, her carefully constructed confidence beginning to fracture in small visible ways. Sophie still held the place card in her hands. She had not let it go since reading it. Her fingers trembled slightly as she looked between me and her mother. Is it true? She asked quietly. Her voice was no longer excited or confused. It was something much more fragile. It was the voice of someone whose foundation had just shifted beneath her feet. Did you really approve this? Denise immediately tried to step forward. Sophie, listen to me, it was just a misunderstanding, just a silly joke that got out of hand. But Sophie took one step backward. Not aggressively. Not dramatically. Just enough to create space. That small movement said more than any argument could have. David finally spoke, his voice low and strained. Your grandmother is making this bigger than it is. I looked at him for a long moment. My own son. The boy I once held through fevers and nightmares and heartbreaks. Now standing in a luxury hotel lobby asking me to minimize my own humiliation so that other people could remain comfortable. Sophie turned toward him sharply. Dad, she refinanced her house. Silence followed immediately. It was not just emotional silence. It was informational silence. The kind that arrives when people realize they no longer control the narrative. Sophie continued, her voice breaking slightly. She paid for almost everything. David looked away. That was all the confirmation she needed. Sophie stepped closer to me slowly, her eyes filled with confusion and pain. "Grandma, why did you not tell me?" I answered gently, because anger would not help her understand this moment. "Because I wanted your day to be peaceful. And because I thought love meant helping quietly." Her eyes filled with tears. "But Mom said she did everything." Denise immediately interrupted. "I managed everything. I coordinated everything. I made this wedding happen." I watched her carefully. Even now, she could not separate leadership from truth. To her, control had become the same thing as contribution. A catering supervisor approached cautiously again, clearly uncomfortable with the tension. "We need a final authorization within the next 30 minutes, he said politely. "Or we will have to reduce the remaining services for tonight's reception." Sophie looked overwhelmed, turning her head slightly as if trying to understand how a single moment had become so complicated so quickly. "Why is everything tied to Grandma?" she asked softly. That question mattered more than anything else that had been said all morning. Because it was the first time she was no longer asking who was right or wrong. She was asking what was real. Denise stepped forward again, forcing a tight smile. "Sweetheart, your grandmother offered to help financially, yes, but this is still our wedding. Your father and I handled the planning, the vision, the coordination." I interrupted gently. "That is not accurate." Denise turned toward me sharply. "Excuse me?" I reached into my folder and removed a printed summary of all payments and transfers. Not dramatically. Not aggressively. Just truth laid out in paper form. I handed it to Sophie. She took it with both hands this time. As she read line after line, her expression changed from confusion to disbelief to something much heavier. Grief. Not for a lost celebration. But for a lost understanding of her own family. "This cannot be real," she whispered. "It is real," I said softly. "Every single line." Sophie looked up at Denise slowly. "You told me you paid for the venue." Denise hesitated for the first time. Just a fraction of a second. But it was enough. Sophie looked at her father next. "You told me you used savings." David rubbed his forehead and said nothing. That silence again. The same silence that had followed me for years whenever I tried to question anything uncomfortable. Sophie stepped back, holding the papers tightly now. Her breathing became uneven. "So what was the joke supposed to mean?" she asked suddenly, remembering the place card again. Her voice shook. "The ATM grandma. Was that funny to you?" Denise quickly responded. "It was taken out of context." But Sophie shook her head slowly. "No," she said quietly. "That is not context. That is cruelty." The word landed heavily in the room. Cruelty. Not misunderstanding. Not mistake. Cruelty. For the first time, Denise had no immediate reply. The control she always relied on was slipping away in real time. Sophie turned toward me again, her eyes red. "Grandma, I am so sorry," she whispered. And I believed her completely. Because her apology came without excuses, without manipulation, without conditions. Just truth and regret. I stepped closer and gently placed my hand on hers. "I know," I said softly. And in that moment, I realized something important. The truth does not destroy families. It only reveals which parts of them were never strong enough to begin with. I still remember the exact feeling of standing in that hotel lobby while everything I had carried silently for years finally stopped being invisible. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was something far more powerful. It was the moment truth stopped asking for permission. Sophie was still holding the papers in her hands, her eyes red, her breathing uneven as she tried to make sense of a reality that no longer matched the story she had been told her entire life. Denise stood beside David, her expression locked between forced composure and rising panic. The carefully built image she had presented to the world all weekend was now cracking under the weight of simple facts printed on official documents. Around us, the lobby had become completely still. Staff members no longer pretended to be busy. Guests no longer pretended not to listen. Even the soft background music from the reception hall felt distant, as if it belonged to another world that no longer mattered. Sophie finally spoke again, her voice trembling but clearer than before. "So everything I was told was not true?" she asked. Nobody answered immediately. That silence itself became the answer. Denise quickly stepped forward, her voice sharper now, losing the polished warmth she had used all weekend. "Sophie, you are being emotional right now. You are misunderstanding everything because your grandmother is choosing to make this into something bigger than it is." But Sophie shook her head slowly. "No," she said quietly. "I am understanding it more clearly than I ever have before." Those words landed heavily in the space between them. David finally looked at me, his face tense with frustration and embarrassment. "Mom, why are you doing this today?" he asked. "This is supposed to be Sophie's wedding." I looked at him for a long moment. My own son. The boy I once believed I would protect for my entire life. "I did not do this today," I replied softly. "This has been happening for years. Today is simply the first time someone else is seeing it." Sophie turned toward her father, her voice breaking slightly. "Dad, did you know?" David hesitated. That hesitation was enough. Sophie stepped back again, her hand still gripping the documents. "You all let me believe Mom paid for everything," she whispered. "You let me thank her. You let me believe I was living in a story that was not real." Denise immediately tried to regain control. "We gave you a beautiful wedding. That is what matters. Not accounting details. Not paperwork. The experience is what matters." But Sophie suddenly raised her voice slightly for the first time. "No," she said firmly. "Truth matters." That single word changed the atmosphere in the room. Truth. Not appearance. Not narrative. Not image. Truth. Sophie looked at me again, and her expression softened in a way I had not seen since she was a child. "Grandma," she said quietly, "I am so sorry for everything you went through." I felt something inside me loosen for the first time in years. Not because the situation had been fixed, but because I was finally being seen as a person again instead of a resource. Denise exhaled sharply, clearly losing patience. "This is absurd," she said. "We are standing here arguing about money while a wedding is supposed to be happening in a few hours." I turned to her calmly. "It stopped being about money the moment you decided to turn me into a joke." That sentence made her freeze. For the first time, she had no immediate response. The control she had relied on for years no longer worked in a room where everyone had already seen the truth. A staff coordinator approached cautiously once again, holding a tablet close to his chest. "We need confirmation for final vendor payments," he said carefully, addressing me directly now. Not Denise. Not David. Me. The shift was subtle but undeniable. I looked at Sophie. She was still crying quietly, but she was listening. Really listening. "What do you want me to do?" I asked her softly. The question was not about finances. It was about everything. Sophie wiped her tears and took a shaky breath. "I do not want anything done out of pressure," she said slowly. "I just want the truth to be acknowledged." That was enough for me. I turned back to the coordinator. "Pause all remaining discretionary payments for now," I said calmly. "We will review everything later today." Denise immediately stepped forward. "You cannot do that. The entire reception depends on those payments." I looked at her without anger. Only clarity. Then perhaps the reception should depend on honesty instead. That was when something shifted completely. Not just in the room, but in the structure of the relationship itself. Sophie stepped closer to me and gently took my hand. "Come with me," she said softly. "Please." I nodded. Together we walked away from the center of the lobby, away from the tension, away from the noise of explanations and excuses. Behind us, I could hear Denise speaking rapidly to David, her voice tight with panic, trying to rebuild control that no longer existed. But I did not look back. Because for the first time in a very long time, I understood something simple and final. I was no longer going to be the silent foundation that allowed other people's stories to stand while mine was erased.